Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon. I apologize for the lateness in starting. Today's hearing will examine U.S. policy regarding the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This conflict was exacerbated by Rwanda's interventions in neighboring eastern Congo, as documented by the release of 3 United Nations reports this year. These reports confirmed Rwanda's support of militia who have ravaged and continue to plague this region. The State Department was unavailable to testify at our September 19th hearing on this issue, and the subcommittee promised at that time to follow up when State was available to testify. In the aftermath of the 1994 genocide, successive U.S. administrations have turned a blind eye to reports of Rwandan plundering of resources from the DRC and support for rebels who have devastated eastern Congo and its people. It seems that guilt over the Clinton administration's colossal failure responding effectively, as they did not, to the genocide in Rwanda has led to subsequent U.S. administrations being reluctant to criticize the government of Rwanda. With these UN reports on that government's behavior in the DRC, we must overcome our regret over what happened 18 years ago. As an NGO letter to President Obama points out, the United States is now out of step with our European allies, who have cut aid to Rwanda because of their interference in the DRC, as recommended by the UN group of experts in their recent reports. The group of experts also recommended imposing sanctions on responsible Rwandan officials, including the defense minister. Additionally, the government of the DRC has failed to ensure that its military adequately provides security for its citizens. In fact, the National Forces of the Democratic Republic of Congo is alleged to be a perpetrator of human rights violations in the East. Security sector reform is critical in the DRC, and the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC, or MONUSCO, has not been able to completely train military elements that too often terrorize their own people instead of protecting them. At this point, it is vital to understand what the administration intends to do about the UN reports on Rwanda's violation of the arms embargo on non-state groups in eastern DRC, and how this impacts U.S. relations with Rwanda. Furthermore, we must know how the administration intends to deal with the DRC government in light of its deficiencies in security sector reform. This hearing will also take a comprehensive look at who is responsible for the insecurity in eastern Congo beyond the two government and the militias. Most attention is being paid to the M23 rebel movement in eastern Congo, and justifiably so, in light of their recent seizure of territory and overall destructive impact on the people of eastern Congo. However, there are reportedly as many as 24 armed groups terrorizing Congolese in this region. According to a November 2012 report from Oxfam, Commodities of War, 9 of these militias are believed to be the most prominent. They range from those with a focus on Rwanda or Uganda to those that were formed in response to the flight of perpetrators of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda to the DRC, or those singularly focused on the DRC itself. Whatever the reason for their founding, these militias have terrorized the people of eastern Congo and the DRC as a whole. We must identify their support base and then the flow of arms and other aid that enables their ongoing reign of terror. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, insecurity in eastern Congo has displaced approximately 2.4 million people nationwide, especially in the east. Despite long-standing conflict in eastern Congo, the OCHA estimates that the majority of displaced persons typically return to their areas of origin within 6 to 18 months of their initial displacement and require minimal return assistance. While that may be true, it does not account for the kind of life Congolese will have once they return to their homes. Women continue to be targeted for gross abuse in the DRC. A study that recently appeared in the American Journal of Public Health concluded that an average of 48 women and girls are raped every hour in the country. So as with our February 2nd and September 19th hearings on the DRC this year, more than 100 females in DRC will have been raped before our hearing today ends. Their rejection by their families, husbands, and communities cast a cloud over their future efforts to recreate communities destroyed by the militias in the DRC. This is an issue that must be addressed by the Congolese themselves, of course, with any help that can be provided from the outside, sooner rather than later. Since our hearing in September, M23 has made significant gains in territorial control, occupying Goma for 10 days while moving southward, potentially towards South Kivu town of Bukavu. However, international pressure played a major role in the group ending its advance southward and withdrawing from Goma town by early December. DR President Joseph Kabila's government and the M23 rebels reportedly have agreed to peace talks in Kampala, sponsored by the government of Uganda. There have been peace talks and peace accords in the DRC before, and they didn't hold, as we all know. Will this effort achieve a lasting peace? The DRC is home to an abundant mineral wealth, including 70% of the world's coltan used to make vital components of cell phones and other electronic equipment, 30% of the world's diamond reserves, and vast deposits of cobalt, copper, and bauxite. Unfortunately, these natural resources have attracted international looters and fueled civil war. Now oil has been discovered in eastern Congo. Can a way be found to prevent the DRC's blessings from being turned into curses? The tragic genocide in Rwanda in 1994 has had lasting repercussions in the DRC. But since the 1880s, resentment over the perceived influx of people considered foreigners in eastern DRC has contributed to conflict in this region, including 2 regional wars. Various leaders in the region have used this antipathy for political purposes, pitting their supporters against their perceived opponents. Can the interethnic problems in the DRC and its neighbors be finally resolved so that a lasting peace among all the people in the DRC be achieved? Our witnesses today are well positioned to address questions regarding a path forward towards sustainable peace in the DRC and the obstacles that lie in that path. It is time now to find a way to bring an end to the horrific suffering of the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for her opening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your leadership on this issue and also for holding this important hearing. While this committee held a hearing on the DRC not too long ago, recent events in eastern Congo motivated closer examination of this current crisis. I want to especially thank Assistant Secretary Ambassador Carson and our other witnesses for offering testimony at today's hearing. I would also like to commend many of you sitting in the audience for your tireless work toward peace and justice for those affected by the past and current crises. Your concerns have been heard, and this committee will continue to elevate the status of the DRC so it receives the international attention needed to bring about lasting peace and stability. Myself, members of this committee, and our colleagues in the Senate are deeply concerned with on-the-ground reports of human rights violations, forced rape, the recruitment of child soldiers, and the involvement of DRC's neighbors in the eastern region. I want to stress that there is great need for the international community to work in common interests toward the resolution of a crisis that goes well beyond the M23. We must not look at the current M23 crisis in some civil, political, or military vacuum. For a credible, reasonable, and long-standing stability to take hold, I urge that transparent and accountable processes be put in place that can address reforms at all levels. I want to be clear on this point. If we are to see an end to the violence and instability, then holistic reforms are desperately needed at all levels, including politically and economically. We must also see a dramatic reevaluation of the social constraints to reforms and civic engagement. The results of the deeply flawed 2011 election lay bare the significant challenges that must be addressed if we are to see a dramatic and positive change of course. Ambassador Carson, I will be interested to hear what new steps the State Department will take to address these very serious challenges that remain unaddressed. Let me remind the committee what is at stake. Continued failure to achieve stability has torn families apart and shown clearly the base actions of those who have no concern for life and have not been brought to justice. For too long, the DRC has been ravaged by instability and war. For 2 decades, eastern Congo has been under siege by armed groups. Yesterday, it was the National Congress for the Defense of the People. Today, it is M23. What will it be tomorrow? Will we stand by and allow a fragile peace to be held together by empty promises? The violence, the rapes, the child soldiers, the murderers must be brought to an end. What is troubling about this recent conflict is the documented involvement by neighboring governments in the DRC's territorial integrity. While the Rwanda and Ugandan governments vehemently deny such involvement, a growing body of evidence raises questions that suggest otherwise. I close these remarks where I began, urging that all efforts be put toward establishing mechanisms that lay the foundation for lasting peace, not only in the DRC, but throughout the region. I ask that a letter being sent to President Obama be submitted for the record, circulated by Representative McDermott. This letter calls for the establishment of a special U.S. envoy, and UN and African Union envoy. The purposes of these roles should be clear: to present a group of international stakeholders that can provide critical and balanced political pressure toward a unified policy to address all aspects of this regional crisis. Also worth mentioning is a second letter to be sent to President Obama and Secretary Clinton, signed by organizations including Africa Faith and Justice Network, the Enough Project, Global Witness, Open Society Foundations, Refugees International, among many others. In addition to calling for special envoys, this group boldly calls for global leadership to engage constructively in a comprehensive political process. Thank you, and I look forward to today's testimonies.
Thank you very much, my friend, Ms. Bass. Any other panelists would like to make an opening comment? Ms. Burkle? Yes, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just would like to raise a point. Throughout the conflict, the mines remain open. Minerals, gems, rare earth provide the financing for the conflict. I think it's a motivation for a great deal of it. Who is buying this material? And what do we know about the chain of both dollars and material on an international basis? And is there anything that we or the UN or the African Union are doing to choke this off? That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Turner, thank you very much. I'd like to now introduce our witness from the U.S. Department of State, Ambassador Johnnie Carson. Serves as Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs, a position he has held since May of 2009. Ambassador Carson has a long and distinguished career in public service, over 37 years in the Foreign Service, including time as our ambassador to Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. Ambassador Carson has also served as the staff director of this subcommittee many years ago, and as a Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania. Ambassador Carson is the recipient of numerous awards for his service from the U.S. Department of State. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, members of the committee, thank you for the very kind invitation to testify before the subcommittee today on the crisis unfolding in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC. As you know, the security and humanitarian situation in the Congo is the most volatile in Africa today. An estimated 5 million people have died in the years since the second regional war began in that country in 1997-1998. And millions more have been forced to flee their homes. The people of North and South Kivu provinces in particular have faced repeated cycles of conflict and shocking atrocities. The November 20th fall of Goma to the M23 rebel group provided a stark reminder that in spite of the international community's major investments in humanitarian aid and peacekeeping, the underlying causes of the recurring conflicts in the eastern DRC remain unresolved. The Congolese government has failed to provide effective security, governance, and services in the eastern provinces, and political and economic tensions persist between the DRC and its eastern neighbors, particularly Rwanda. Since the M23 rebellion erupted last spring, the United States has worked closely with international and regional partners to mobilize a comprehensive response aimed at preventing a further deterioration of the situation. Secretary Clinton, Ambassador Rice, and Undersecretary Wendy Sherman have spoken or met with senior Congolese, Rwandan, Ugandan, and UN officials to advocate for a rapid and peaceful resolution to this crisis. In the UN Security Council, we have taken action to ensure that 5 of the M23's most abusive commanders are now under targeted sanctions. We have also stressed the need to hold accountable all of those who commit human rights abuses and atrocities. And I myself traveled to the DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda between November 24 and 28 with my British and French counterparts to deliver a clear and common message that the Congolese, Rwandan, and Ugandan governments must work together to stop this crisis and to work towards a sustainable resolution of underlying issues. All 3 governments reiterated to us their commitment to these goals. We also stressed that there should be no impunity for senior M23 leaders who are under ICC indictment or international sanctions for human rights abuses. The M23 would not be the threat that it is today without external support, and we will continue to discourage outside parties from providing any assistance to the M23 movement. There is a creditable body of evidence that corroborates key findings of the groups of experts' reports concerning Rwandan government support to the M23, including military, logistical, and political assistance. The British government has recently indicated that it shares this assessment. We do not have a similar body of evidence that Uganda has a government policy of support for the M23. Based on this evidence, we have repeatedly pressed Rwanda to halt and prevent any and all forms of support to Congolese armed groups. Looking forward, we expect all parties, including Rwanda, to cease any support to M23 and other armed groups, abide by the Kampala Accords of November 21 and 24, and to work constructively with its neighbors and the international community and take affirmative steps to end impunity for M23 commanders responsible for human rights abuses in order to reach an acceptable political agreement. We ask the government of Uganda to also ensure that supplies to the M23 do not originate in or transit through Ugandan territory, including from individual officials who might be acting on their own. The Department continues to monitor closely all potential sources of external support, and we will continue to respond appropriately, including by reviewing our assistance to deter this support as the situation develops. We are taking a number of other steps in concert with other international partners as a part of our comprehensive response to the current crisis. First and foremost, we are monitoring humanitarian needs and mobilizing an appropriate response. The humanitarian situation in the eastern Congo remains deplorable, as it has been for years. But recent attacks by the M23 and other armed groups have displaced hundreds of thousands and left some areas of North and South Kivu inaccessible to humanitarian response. The United States provided more than $110 million in humanitarian assistance for Congolese refugees, internally displaced persons, and conflict-affected civilians in fiscal year 2012. And at the UN, we have urged donors to respond to the UN's consolidated appeal for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Second, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, known as the ICGLR, the African Union, and the Security Council have all demanded that the M23 refrain from further offensive operations and to remain out of Goma. While the Congolese government has agreed to hear the grievances of the M23 in discussions that are now taking place in Kampala, we continue to call for accountability for the M23's most abusive leaders. And we will continue to speak out against the forcible recruitment of children and the other crimes of the M23's soldiers and rebels. Third, we believe that Presidents Kabila, Kagame, and Museveni must continue to engage in direct talks to address the underlying causes of instability in the region, as well as the potential drivers of progress. We support the appointment of a UN special envoy to facilitate a long-term solution of these problems, and we will consult with the UN Secretary General about this. We will work to ensure that any agreement between the parties is transparent, sustainable, and enjoys the support and commitment of the region. Fourth, more must be done to protect civilians in the eastern DRC. We and our fellow Security Council members and troop-contributing countries are reviewing options for improving the UN's ability to protect civilians and help implement defined aspects of a potential regional political settlement. Fifth, the DRC government has the primary responsibility for protecting its territory and all of its citizens. We are urging President Kabila to take clear and bold measures to ensure that the soldiers of the Congolese Army are professionally trained, adequately paid and supported, and respectful of their citizens and of international human rights norms. The extension of effective governance, combined with legitimate provincial elections, would also help to underpin a lasting peace. We believe that the time has come for the region's leaders and the international community to break the cycle of violence and impunity that has existed for far too long in the eastern DRC. We, and most importantly, the region's political leaders, must ensure that the national security and territory integrity of the DRC, Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi are protected. We must help build a future for people who have seen more conflict than peace over the past 2 decades. We must help turn the vast mineral and agricultural wealth of the eastern DRC into a source of economic pride and progress, benefiting the people of the region and not contributing to conflict. The leaders of the region must establish nonviolent means of addressing their political, security, economic, and border differences. As Secretary Clinton noted when she visited Goma in 2009, the Congolese people are courageous and resilient, and there are reasons for hope across the entirety of the DRC. including progress toward paying soldiers through electronic and mobile banking, and building the capacity to provide justice in response to mass atrocities and human rights violations. We need to build on these steps, which have been gravely set back by the current M23 rebellion. The decisions taken today, the decisions taken now will have a direct impact on what happens over the next several months as well as the next several years. They will affect the behavior of other militias in the Kivus, the success of reforms to promote the conflict-free trade and mineral resources, and the ability to sustain operations against the vicious Lord's Resistance Army of Joseph Kony that has operated in the northern part of the DRC and in the Central African Republic. Today's crisis is a tragedy, but it also offers a genuine opportunity to help the Congolese people set a more sustainable course towards peace and stability in their own country as well as with their neighbors. The framework for action at the national, regional, and international levels that I have outlined today could help enable the peoples of the region to escape the recurring cycles of conflict which have hampered progress in the Eastern Congo for nearly 2 decades. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify this afternoon. I have a longer submission for the record, which you may have. I look forward to answering any of your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And without objection, your full statement, letters referenced by Ms. Bass before, will be made a part of the record. Mr. Ambassador, a couple of hours ago, at least online, the Guardian newspaper posted an article, the title of which is Obama accused of failed policy over Rwanda's support of rebel group. And it points out the letter that we all are aware of, signed by 15 organizations that take the administration to task for its policy. The article begins, leading campaign groups and think tanks have written to Barack Obama accusing him of a failed policy over Rwanda's support for rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo and calling on the president to impose sanctions. The letter says, in pertinent part, as the situation once again dramatically deteriorates in eastern Congo, the U.S. response to the crisis has patently failed and is out of step with other Western nations. Since M23 was created in the spring of 2012, U.S. officials continued to place faith in engaging Rwanda in a constructive dialogue. This approach has clearly failed to change Rwanda's policy, as evidenced by the direct involvement of the Rwandan army in the recent takeover of Goma, as documented by the United Nations group of experts. Of course, not of course, but the Rwandans say that it's the report is fabricated, and the UN group report does say, and they quote this as well, that Rwandan officials coordinated the creation of the rebel movement as well as its major military operations, as well as providing troops and arming the group. It recommends imposing sanctions against Rwandan officials. You have just testified there is a credible body of evidence that corroborates key findings of the group of experts' reports, including evidence of significant military and logistical support, as well as operational and political guidance from the Rwandan government to the M23. You also point out that we do not have similar body of evidence that Uganda has a government-wide policy of support to M23. Now, as we all know, and I, on the House side, pushed very hard to get this legislation passed, a bill that was authored by then-Senator Barack Obama, called the Democratic Republic of Congo Relief, Security, and Democratic Promotion Act of 2006, that calls on the U.S. government to withhold assistance to any foreign countries taking actions to destabilize the DRC. And I'm wondering if you could tell us, do the actions of Rwanda merit a withdrawal of funding? Does it not rise to, given the collaboration of evidence, as you've pointed out, to withholding aid to Rwanda until they change?
First of all, Mr. Chairman, I reject the headline that the administration has failed to speak out against the M23 and against those.
That's not what they said, with all due respect. They talked about a failed policy, not that we didn't speak out against M23. So please be clear.
I think what we say and do is a part of the policy effort, and I reject that notion, and I must reject it pretty soundly. First and foremost, we have been engaged on this issue since the M23 rebellion began in April of this year. Since April up until yesterday, we have, at all levels of the U.S. government, senior levels of the U.S. government, been working to advance greater peace and stability, an end to the current fighting, a current withdrawal of M23 from Goma, and discussions between the leaders in the region. Let me just give you a quick catalog. Certainly between April and September, I and Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, were in contact on numerous occasions telephonically with leaders in the region. I also met with leaders about this issue at the African Union Summit in June. In September of this year, Secretary Clinton invited the presidents of Rwanda and of the DRC to meet with her on the margins of the UN General Assembly to try to find ways to end the current rebellion. We participated in September as well in Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's special meeting on the Great Lakes region. In addition, Undersecretary Wendy Sherman traveled to the region in October, met with Presidents Kagame, Kabila, and Museveni, and this was one of the most important of her sets of meetings out there. She met with President Kagame for over 5 hours in Kigali on that visit. Shortly after that, we actually did take some action because we had information that we believed indicated Rwandan support. We cut off our foreign military financing to the Rwandan government, one of the first such public acts by any government. And I can say that I traveled to the region for several days just after Thanksgiving and traveled to Kampala, to Kigali, and to Kinshasa to meet with the leaders of all three countries. I also traveled there with my British and French counterparts. In addition, we have sanctioned M23 leaders. We are about to sanction more M23 leaders and officials. And we have continued to advance our diplomacy as well as speak out against what has been happening in the region. So, Mr. Chairman, with all due respect, anyone who would suggest that we have been inactive would be enacted.
Again, Mr. Secretary or Mr. Ambassador, you're both, no one's suggesting inactivity. It's the policy itself that is under scrutiny and being criticized by those 15 organizations. And there has, I mean, let me ask you this. Are there sanctions contemplated, or have there been any sanctions imposed upon any Rwandese officials or military?
No, but we have, as I pointed out, implemented sanctions which have cut off foreign military financing to the Rwandan government and to the Rwandan military.
Let me ask you,
Those
Mr.
are
Secretary.
sanctions, and I think they're very public, and they have been terminated.
You mentioned support for a UN envoy. How about a U.S. envoy?
We actually have a U.S. envoy for the Great Lakes region. His name is Ambassador Barry Walkley. He has been on the job for nearly a year. Ambassador Walkley is infinitely qualified to serve as our envoy there. He has served in 2 Francophone African countries as ambassador, and he's previously served as Deputy Chief of Mission in the DRC. He travels to the region quite frequently, and so there is an envoy out there already. One may quibble with the level, but the existence is there. He is active, and he is working hard on this issue along with other officials.
Understood. But the gravitas of a presidential envoy, I believe, would send perhaps a stronger message to those that are part of the peace process. Let me ask you, if I could, John Prendergast, in his statement, very strongly says, by global standards, the international effort to construct a credible peace process for Congo is manifestly derelict, condemning that country to further cycles of devastating conflict. When the curtain is pulled back and one looks behind the occasional United Nations Security Council resolution calling simply for an end to the violence, the international diplomatic response is revealed to be shockingly ineffective, perhaps even violating the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. Then he goes on from there. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think I don't need to respond for the entire international community. All I do is respond for the U.S. government. I know Mr. Prendergast. We have been longtime colleagues and friends. He has a great deal of knowledge and expertise on the region. But I would submit that the actions that we have taken reflect a high degree of interest in this situation.
Would troops recently pledged by the South African Development Community comprise a credible force to protect the DRC-Rwanda border?
Last week, the SADC countries met in Dar es Salaam, and there they agreed to send in some 4,000 troops into the eastern DRC to serve as a international, or I should say a neutral international force. 1,000 troops were pledged by Tanzania. The other 3,000 were going to be drawn from a Southern African standby force. I do not know the capacity or the ability of the countries in the region to pull those troops together. But what I would say is that the UN currently has the largest peacekeeping force in the world in the DRC. And if there is an interjection of a new force, it should be done very carefully in cooperation and collaboration with the United Nations. It should be well thought out and well resourced, and one should consider whether it is not better to augment and integrate those new forces into an expanded and more assertive UN force than to create a new force that would be operating in the area in which there are already a large number of military and rebel forces. It could create some concerns about operational effectiveness and operational overlaps.
I, too, have been in Goma myself a few years back and know how unbelievably unstable that area is. Part of the problem, I believe, is that there is insufficient troops deployed, even under the large UN deployment there. And then there's always the question of the rules of engagement. Let me ask you one final question. I have many, but then I'll yield to my friend, Ms. Bass. There are rumors, maybe they're just rumors, that the administration sought to delay the UN group of experts report on the DRC this past summer and attempted to soften criticism of Rwandan involvement with M23. Can you speak to that?
I reject that as out of hand.
Okay. And one final question. The Rwandans join the UN Security Council next year. Does that have any bearing on what our policy will be, particularly when it comes to sanctions, since they will be on the Security Council?
No, it does not. I would just hope that the Rwandans, when they join the Council, will carry out their duties in a responsible and thoughtful way, just as the other 15 members of the Security Council do.
Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Ambassador Carson. I want to change the subject a little bit and wanted to ask if you could speak to some of the background of the M23. I mean, I do understand, when they started and why, but I just wanted to know if you had any further insight as to what their ultimate aim is. What's the motivation for them to continue? And also the idea, you mentioned that there wouldn't be impunity to the commanders of the M23 to be reintegrated back into the DRC's armed forces, but how do you reintegrate any of them? How big is the M23? How many soldiers are there?
Let me speak to the first question of aim and motivation. I believe that the current group of M23 rebels want to be able to maintain themselves as consolidated military units in the eastern part of the DRC. I think they see themselves as guardians of the Tutsi population in the east. I suspect that some of them have political ambitions and would seek to try to be able to be the top officials in local administrations in the east. Beyond that, I don't know what their aims and motivations are. I know that when this rebellion started back in March and April, there was a clear desire on the part of the now constituted M23 rebels not to be moved from the eastern part of the DRC into other parts of the country. And their officers did not want to leave the military commands in which they had been assigned to take on different commands. Impunity, I think there should not be impunity for those M23 leaders who fall into three categories. Those who are clearly ICC indictees, those for whom there are international and binational sanctions already, and thirdly, for those where there is evidence or a growing body of evidence that they have in fact committed atrocities and war crimes and rapes throughout the last 7 or 8 months. I don't have an exact figure for the number of M23 rebels. Initially, when they broke away in April of this year, the number was probably no more than 1,000. Today, that number has probably swelled for a lot of reasons, but it is not a legion of people.
Well, you know, when you were saying previously that what the president, one of the things that led to the recent rebellion was the president trying to scatter the troops, because how can you ever have peace if, even if you did have sanctions against the top commanders, how can you have an army where you have a faction that wants to separate and operate independently? I don't know how that works. So
it doesn't work very well, but let me say that there have been a number of countries that have effectively integrated rebel groups into their militaries, and in the process have made those militaries stronger and more consolidated. Here, I think there was an effort by the M23 not to leave the Kivus, not to be reassigned to other parts of the DRC, and for their leaders not to move out of the areas in which they called home. I don't think you can effectively operate a military in which you have a reintegrated rebel group deciding what it wants to do rather than what the military command and the government wants it to do.
Right, exactly. You had also talked previously about the ongoing tension on the border of Rwanda and the DRC, and you mentioned the UN peacekeeping forces and also the possibility of troops coming from South Africa to secure that border. Where are the peacekeeping troops? Are they all over? Aren't they already on that border?
No, they aren't. I think that the MONUSCO troops are scattered throughout the eastern part of North and South Kivus. They are there largely to protect civilian populations, refugees, and displaced persons. They are not, in fact, monitoring or working and observing along the border, but are near and in towns, villages, near refugee camps and displaced persons camps to respond to crises and to help the FARDC, the Congolese military, when they are called upon to do so.
Could you speak to the impact that conflict minerals might be playing, the role conflict minerals might be playing, especially in providing resources to the M23?
Let me say that conflict minerals have always been a factor in providing resources to rebel groups in the eastern part of the Congo. But quite honestly, as serious as conflict minerals are, they are probably not the primary reason for the current crisis. They are one of the underlying systemic reasons why the crisis can continue, but I think that the current crisis is to be found in what are the so-called grievances and indiscipline of the M23 and the support that they have received from outside of the country.
And then finally, how would you assess the U.S. government's response to the humanitarian crisis in the eastern region of the DRC? Maybe you could describe it.
Yeah, I think, as I noted in my testimony, we've given in excess of $110 million in humanitarian assistance.
Right, and maybe you could explain what some of those dollars are for.
These dollars are used to provide food to displaced persons throughout both North and South Kivus. It is to provide food and assistance to refugee populations who are there. It is to provide shelter material and blankets. It's also to provide clean and potable water, and also to provide prophylaxis for malaria, and also to medicines for dealing with issues of cholera and hygiene.
And I'm sorry, just one final question. What more would you like to see from Congress? How can we be helpful in the situation?
Congresswoman Bass, I think your hearings, hearings such as this one, give us downtown an opportunity to indicate to you what we are doing. They also give us an opportunity to hear from you what things you think we haven't been doing that might be useful to do to improve the situation.
Without objection, a statement from World Relief will be made a part of the record. I yield to Mr. Marino.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here today. Mr. Ambassador, my research shows me that the United States, perhaps with some assistance from other countries in Europe, have given about $1 billion over the last 10 years to Rwanda and not quite that much to Uganda. Can you explain if we have reduced any amount given to either of those countries and how much?
Mr. Congressman, we have certainly in the last 6 months reduced our foreign military financing to Rwanda by some $200,000. This would have been monies that the Rwandan military could have used for the financing and purchasing of equipment. We have not reduced any of our development assistance money to Rwanda. And I might say here that Rwanda does a remarkably good job of utilizing its foreign assistance resources, probably more effective than most countries across Africa. They do a very good job in using that money to provide health care, agriculture, education to their people, and they do get very high marks for that. We have not touched any of their development assistance money.
How do you draw the distinction between where that, did you say 200,000? That's a drop in a bucket, $200,000. And I think the remark from the Prime Minister or the General was $200,000 is nothing. It doesn't bother us at all. So it doesn't seem that we're very serious about this, blatantly not very serious about this. And how is the so-called remainder of the billion over the 10 years, less the 200,000, how is that dispersed and who disperses it?
I'm not sure what the billion is that you're referring to.
The $1 billion that my research shows that the U.S., with some assistance from Europe, has given Rwanda over the last decade. Now, you say that's been reduced at least this year. I'm assuming it's this year by $200,000. So if you break that billion over a 10-year period, still $200,000 is nothing over an annual basis. And how can we guarantee that even though there is a reduction of $200,000, and you say, I believe you say to the military, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it's all fungible?
It's not fungible. Let me first of all say that in fiscal year 2012 that has just concluded, we provided Rwanda with some $195 million in assistance. This money went primarily into health and to agricultural programs. Rwanda has used its development assistance dollars extraordinarily well. As I said, probably better than most other African countries and most other developing countries.
How do you follow that?
Moreover, we do not provide them with direct budgetary support. We are not providing them with a check or with cash. We work through NGOs, through international development organizations and agencies, and there is a high degree of accountability for all of the funding that we have given to the Rwandan government. Their utilization of foreign assistance in an effective manner really is not at question nor at issue, because in that regard we have to be both frank and honest, and they do a very good job. We don't give them cash. We don't write them a check, but the monies that they get through the international partners is effectively utilized for the purposes it is intended for.
Yeah, I understand through my research and contacts that there's been a great deal of hijacking of these resources by groups such as M23 and using that for their own purposes or selling that to buy weapons. Do you have any information on that?
I'm not aware of that whatsoever.
Has the U.S. had any contact directly or indirectly with M23 leaders?
No. I am not aware of any direct contact between U.S. officials and M23 leaders. There have been 2 meetings in Kampala between leaders of the M23 and members of the DRC government. Along with other diplomats, we have been in the room as observers when those sessions have been public, but we have had no direct contact, which I am aware, with any, and I underscore any, M23 leaders.
Are there any plans to get more directly involved, for whatever reason, by the Department of State with M23?
No, not at the no, not that I'm aware of it. Certainly not.
You stated that the numbers have increased with M23. They've swelled over the last several months. For what reasons?
Defections from the FARDC, recruitment of individuals in the communities that they have captured and taken over, the forced recruitment of young men. All of these have contributed to an expansion of their numbers.
Okay. You started explaining a little bit the reason for the crises, but can you expand upon your answer as what you see the cause, the direct cause of the crisis that's taking place, particularly with M23's origination?
Well, M23 grows out of the an organization called the CNDR, which was integrated into the Congolese army back in March of 2009. Most of these individuals were from North and South Kivu. They were a part of a rebel movement. Most of them were Rwandaphones and Tutsis in origin. In order to bring an end to a previous rebellion by this group, the government of the DRC brought them in to the military, integrated them in, and attempted to make them a part of the army. They broke away in April of this year. I might add that not all of the CNDR members from 2009 and before broke away. Some of them remained in the army. But the principal reasons for their decision to bolt and run, they claim, was a failure of the DRC government to live up to the agreement of March 23, 2009. But other things that are clear is that the DRC government wanted to move units, some of these integrated CNDR units to other parts of the country. They resisted this. They wanted to move some of the leadership to other parts of the country. They resisted this. President Kabila also did something that disturbed the CNDR, and he announced that he would try to arrest one of the most notorious of the CNDR leaders who had been integrated into the Army, and that was Bosco Ntaganda, who was an ICC in Daiti. And so all of these reasons that have a lot to do with disgruntlement within this integrated rebel fashion are the background to the current crisis.
Chairman, two short questions, please. Mr. Ambassador, you stated that the aid that we are supplying to Rwanda via NGOs, how can we guarantee that any of that aid is not going into regions controlled by M23?
Again, I want to separate both the DRC from Rwanda. We have no evidence, no proof that any of the aid that we have given to Rwanda has been misused or mischanneled into the hands of any rebel group. As I said before, the issue here really is not about the effective utilization of aid and aid resources. Rwanda has a high level of credibility with respect to the way it uses its resources. That's not at issue. I have no doubt that they are using their resources well. So it's not funneling across the border, and it's not direct assistance. So we work with NGOs and international organizations. We audit what we give, and they use it efficiently. It's not being misused. And in the areas of the DRC, we are providing only humanitarian support and assistance, and that humanitarian support and assistance is going through organizations mostly UN organizations, World Food Program, or through UNHCR, or through the development assistance arm of the international, of the United Nations, or through Caritas or Save the Children or ICRC.
Is that an audit that the State Department conducts, or is that an audit based on information that the NGOs give the State Department?
We can provide you with a full answer to this, but USAID conducts routine audits of all of its assistance programs. I cannot tell you when they did the last ones with respect to these programs, but they conduct routine audits to ensure that there is accountability. Again, that's not at issue here.
Okay. And how do you get the attention of a country like Rwanda and Uganda from supporting M23 by not stopping aid to the country, whether it's for humanitarian needs or not? How do you get their attention?
By engaging them continuously, diplomatically, at a high level, and by doing such things as indicating that we, as we have done, that we will cut off their foreign military financing if they persist in carrying on.
And I don't mean to be facetious, but this may be more rhetorical than a question that you have to answer. But how's that negotiating going?
It's like any set of negotiations, sometimes much longer than any of us would like, but we know that persistence over the long run pays off.
So is your position that the U.S. keep the plan that they have in operation right now and continue trying to negotiate this? At what point do you stop? How many people have to die before you stop the negotiations and get serious about this?
We can't stop. We continue, and we will continue to persist. This is not in our hands alone. We can only facilitate. We can only encourage. We can only prod, cajole, and push. Peace and the effort to bring about peace and stability is always in the hands of those who are adversaries. Our desire is to get them to see reason and to see it sooner rather than later. And to understand that the persistence of conflict and violence only means greater loss of life and hurt for people. But it's not simply in our hands. We can only do as much as we can to bring people to the table and encourage them to see reason.
And in closing, this is more of a statement than it is a question. From my reading and research, it seems that this situation is not getting the attention that I think is required from the United Nations as well. Thank you, Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much. Without objection, the audit information requested by Mr. Marino and promised by Ambassador Carson will be made a part of the record, so we look forward to receiving it. Chair recognizes Chairman Rice.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Let me just ask Ambassador Carson a couple of questions. One, just going to UNESCO's mandate, I think the force there of M23, that militia, is probably about 2,500 people from at least the press accounts. And I know the French have a perspective here that the ability to secure the safety of the civilian population could be addressed by a more robust authorization that would allow them to come to the defense of the civilian population. And I was going to ask you that question. And the second question I was going to ask you goes to the issue of naming Rwanda for its involvement here with M23. And I know there was that debate in the Security Council over whether or not we would expressly name them. And as I recall, the U.S. position was not to do so at the time. But I think in light of events since then, we've now sort of taken the position, or it seems that the administration has taken the position, that we are pointing to Rwanda's engagement here. So de facto, maybe we've named them. Just a couple of your observations on those 2 points, Ambassador.
Chairman Royce, thank you very, very much for both of those questions, and also thank you for your continued interest in Africa. Let me respond to the second question first and repeat a part of my testimony that you may have missed at the beginning. I said that the M23 would not be the threat that it is today without external support. And we will continue to discourage outside parties from providing any assistance to the M23. There is a creditable body of evidence that corroborates key findings of the group of experts' reports concerning Rwandan government support to the M23, including military, logistical, and political assistance.
Ambassador, I think you put that very, very well. My only question was we hadn't put it in the resolution, in Resolution 2076, and perhaps it should have been there, but you couldn't be more explicit than you just were, and I thank you for that. There was another. And let me just ask you about the proposed alternatives to ensure more civilian safety with respect to the mandate.
Mr. Chairman, the current MONUSCO mandate is for some 20,000 UN peacekeepers. Currently, that mandate is undersubscribed by approximately 2,000 individuals. I think MONUSCO today has a force level of approximately 17,700 individuals. Certainly, it would be desirable to see the full complement of the mandate met. It certainly would help to allow the MONUSCO to carry out its responsibilities. Following in the aftermath of the current situation in Goma and the eastern Congo, I think I also made reference in my statement to the fact that it would be useful for a reexamination of the effectiveness of the force and whether the mandates and other responsibilities are being met and whether there are adequate resources to meet them. But the force is undersubscribed by approximately 2,000 people.
Thank you, Ambassador. The last question I'll ask you just goes to this group, the Allied Democratic Forces National Army for the Liberation of Uganda, which has been around for a while, and it goes to this issue of rebel groups increasingly joining forces beyond their national borders. This particular group has done some work with al-Shabaab and a bombing, for example, July 11th, 2010 in Kampala, which killed, I think, over 70 people. And so you have this nexus. If we look at the leader of this group, he got his training. I think he's a converted Catholic, Jamil Makulu, who converted to radical Islam probably while he was in Sudan. But in Sudan, he met Osama bin Laden, and through the initial work with these radical organizations, put together his own little vision of how he could create change, and created a lot of mayhem, but none of it that spectacular until al-Shabaab began to give him the wherewithal, to carry out attacks like this one. And I was going to ask you about that phenomenon. You have these organizations where part of his support network come from disaffected Congolese, and here's Ugandans in the operation as well, and people from throughout the region who join a cause that becomes sort of transnational, and begin working. In this case, they suspect him of working with Al-Qaeda as well. Ambassador Carson, just anything you can do to bring me up to speed in terms of organizations like this that, frankly, he's based right now in Eastern Kivu. So, we've got in North Kivu. So we've got the same phenomenon spreading, apparently.
Mr. Chairman, three quick points on that. First of all, it is absolutely essential that all the states in the region agree and commit themselves not to harbor, not to support, not to defend, not to provide equipment or sustenance or training to rebel groups operating against the leaders of a neighboring state. This is one of the problems that we face today with the M23. It is also a problem that we face with the allied democratic forces. This is incumbent upon all of them, incumbent upon every state in the Great Lakes to do this. If we could get that, we could cut off a lot of the support for rebel groups. With respect to the allied democratic forces, indeed, they have been operating in the eastern part of North Kivu against the Ugandans. The government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo needs to do everything that it possibly can to not allow groups like this to continue to operate out of and from their territory. I'm not in any way accusing them of aiding and abetting, but the mere fact that they don't have security and control of their territory effectively allows this to go on. But it needs to stop, clearly needs to stop. Third point, with respect to the leader of the Allied Democratic Front, Mr. Mukulu, we have, in fact, sanctioned him. We have imposed both visa, travel, and financial sanctions on him in response to the very criminal things that we know that he is responsible for doing.
Ambassador, thank you very much, and thank you for all your work on the ground in Africa with these groups. I know that as things were unfolding in Eastern Congo, you were there trying to influence the course of events, and we appreciate that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Royce. Let me ask just two final questions, and Ms. Bass, if you have a final question, please fire away. Again, you have, in your testimony, made it very clear that there's credible evidence, body of evidence that corroborates key findings of the group of experts, including evidence of significant military and logistical support, as well as operational and political guidance from the Rwandan government to the M23. I know on your most recent trip you were precluded the opportunity to meet with Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda. Did the officials with whom you met with, did they dispute that? And when Secretary Sherman met with President Kagame some months back, several weeks back, Did she get a report back from him? Did he tell her that this is all rubbish, not true? Or did he admit to any of it? And secondly, one of my most disappointing takeaways today, and Mr. Marino, I think, drew you out further on the suspension of foreign military financing, that we're talking about $200,000 when the 2006 Act at least envisioned a more robust and credible sanction against a country that is aiding and abetting a nefarious organization like M23. So if you could speak to whether or not additional sanctions are under consideration, at least, against Rwanda and specific individuals as well.
Mr. Chairman, let me answer the first question. You are correct. As I stated earlier, I and my British and French colleagues met in Kampala for several hours with President Museveni, and in Kinshasa we met for an extended period of time with President Kabila, as well as his foreign minister and his prime minister. In Kigali, it is regrettable that President Kagame chose not to meet with us. The message about our concerns, again, not just those of the United States, but Britain and France. We travel there as the P3, the three permanent members of the Security Council who have worked together on many, many issues. But we did speak with the Foreign Minister, Louise Mishigawaba, plus some of her colleagues. Again, we raised the issue of the need to end outside support. As in previous discussions, the Rwandan government strongly, vehemently denies that it is providing any assistance to the M23, and it has not taken the steps of publicly denouncing on a bilateral basis the M23. So we have raised this, and it's important that we continue to monitor this, as others in the international community do, on a very, very close basis. With respect to your second question about international support to, or at least our bilateral support to the Rwandan government, I start with what I said to Congressman Marino earlier, is that they utilize their international assistance, not only from us in particular, but others very, very effectively. And they use it with great integrity. People get it. We are not providing any cash or check transfers. It all goes through international organization and donor groups that work with the government. We don't think there is a level of fungibility, and we do not believe that the money is being misused or misdirected. We focused on the military because that's where the issue and the problem derives. I know that a number of European governments have suspended large amounts of funding to the Rwandan government, but they handle their resources differently. In most instances, they are making budgetary transfers that are cash payments and checks to the government. We don't do that. So it's a very, very different thing. Our desire is not to hurt the Rwandan people. Our desire is not to cut them off from essential support for agricultural, education, or health programs. Our real desire is
Understood,
to get a
Mr.
change in the regional policy.
But sanctioning individuals within the Rwandan government would not in any way hurt individuals. And frankly, the argument you're making, I served in this panel and began my service on this panel in my second term in 1983 and voted in favor of sanctioning South Africa. And there were people who said, you will hurt innocent people if you do so. But sometimes the egregious harm is so compelling that a very strong statement needs to be made. But minimally, I would think we would want to sanction individuals in the Rwandan government.
Mr. Chairman, I've heard your request and your concerns.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to now ask our second panel if they make their way to the witness table, beginning first with Steve Hege, who has worked on the Eastern DRC, where he has served for 3 consecutive mandates as the armed groups expert for the United Nations Group of Experts on the DRC. He investigated and co-authored 6 public reports submitted and presented to the UN Security Council Sanctions Committee during the group's recently expired 2012 mandate. He was also the coordinator of the 6-member team working under Security Council Resolution 2021. Prior to joining the UN Group of Experts, Mr. Hege worked with several humanitarian and peacebuilding, I should say, organizations. We will then hear from John Prendergast, who's a human rights activist, a best-selling author, and co-founder of the Enough Project, an initiative to end genocide and crimes against humanity. He has worked for the Clinton administration, the State Department, and in Congress. He has also worked for the National Intelligence Council, UNICEF, Human Rights Watch, the International Crisis Group, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. He has helped fund schools in Darfurian refugee camps and helped launch the Satellite Sentinel project with George Clooney. Mr. Prendergast has worked for peace in Africa for well over a quarter of a century. Then we will hear from Memvemba Dinzalela, who is a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and professor lecturer in African Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Mr. Dinzalela has testified several times before the Congress. His work has appeared frequently in many major news publications, and he is a frequent commentator on African affairs on television and radio. He has served as an election monitor in the DRC in 2006 and again in 2011, and has also been embedded with the United Nations peacekeepers as a reporter there. In addition, he is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. Thank you for your service, and I'd like to now go to Steve Hege.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights, thank you for this invitation to testify at this hearing on the current crisis in the Eastern Congo. I have been working on the Congo for over 8 years, including the past 3 as a member of the United Nations Group of Experts. The Group of Experts mandate recently expired on 30 November, during which I served as the coordinator of our 6-member team. As such, I am no longer affiliated with the United Nations, and the views I share today do not reflect those of the organization or that of the Group of Experts, but rather strictly my personal perspectives. The Group of Experts is a Security Council mandated body which reports to the Council's Sanctions Committee. Its role is to investigate, document, and inform the Sanctions Committee of violations of the United Nations arms embargo on non-state actors in the DRC, as well as related issues such as the illegal trade in natural resources and serious violations of international law, including the recruitment and use of child soldiers. During the course of the previous mandate, the group found that since the very outset of the M23 rebellion, the government of Rwanda had provided direct military support to M23, facilitated recruitment, encouraged desertions from the Congolese army, and delivered arms, ammunition, political advice, and intelligence to the rebels. At the strategic level, Rwanda has also spearheaded fundraising and membership drives for the political cadres, even nominating the movement's political leadership and directly instructing them of their demands to be made before the Congolese government. The Rwandan army has not only set up an elaborate recruitment network within Rwanda to ensure a steady supply of new troops to M23, including children, but they have also integrated their own officers and trainers within M23's chain of command on the ground in North Kivu. During all major During all major military operations, the Rwandan army has deployed thousands of additional troops to reinforce M23 in their principal attacks, such as the recent offensive on Goma. While members of the international community have expected Rwanda to diminish its support in light of diplomatic and financial pressure, the group has found that such direct involvement has only increased with time, precisely because M23's de facto chain of command culminates with the Minister of Defense of Rwanda, General James Kabarebe. Nevertheless, the government of Rwanda continues to deny any involvement. In Annex 3 of our final report, we thoroughly responded to each of their criticisms. However, when its substantive arguments proved unconvincing, Rwanda turned to attacking the group of experts, claiming bias, and even orchestrating a media campaign defending that I was a sympathizer of the Rwandan Hutu rebels of the FDLR and a denier of the Rwandan genocide. Nevertheless, Rwanda had previously recognized my objectivity through the group's extensive detailed investigations on the support networks and financing of the FDLR in recent years. In addition to Rwandan backing to M23, in our final reports, the group documented support for the rebels from important networks within the government of Uganda. Senior Ugandan officials provided the rebels with direct troop reinforcement in Congolese territory, weapons deliveries, technical assistance, joint planning, political advice, and facilitation of external relations. They also supported the creation and expansion of the political branch of M23 permanently based in Kampala, even before President Kabila had ever authorized any interaction with the rebels. A Ugandan government representative acknowledged this type of support was indeed taking place in an official meeting of the group of experts in early October. Throughout our mandate, the question most often posed to us was quite natural and logical. Why? Why would Rwanda undertake such a risky and politically dangerous endeavor? Though it is not the work of the group of experts to establish causes or drivers of conflict, I will humbly attempt to analyze some of the stated motives behind this war, beginning with M23's key demands. Since the rebellion's initial stages, M23 has presented an assortment of demands and justifications. First, the rebels have claimed that the government reneged on the 23 March 2009 peace agreements. Nevertheless, in reality, this accord was essentially an afterthought to formalize a bilateral deal between Kinshasa and Kigali, which was predicated on the affording the latter with immense influence in the Kivus in exchange for arresting CNDP chairman Laurent Nkunda and forcing the rest of the CNDP to join the National Army under the leadership of Bosco Ntaganda. For many within the CNDP and the Rwandan government, the integration of the CNDP into the Congolese army was merely a tactical move, but never constituted a fundamental alteration of their objectives. The short-term deal, nevertheless, was immensely generous to Rwanda, the Congolese officers of the CNDP, particularly Ntaganda and his loyal officers, who took control over much of the army in the eastern Congo. Paradoxically, the rebels have also complained of the pervasive corruption within the Congolese army. Nevertheless, as the most powerful commanders in the eastern DRC, they were some of the worst perpetrators of salary theft and racketeering. Moreover, the rebels have claimed discrimination of Tutsi officers within the army and the killing of those former CNDP officers who had been redeployed outside of the Kivus. While certain historical animosities cannot be denied, dozens of Tutsi senior officers and over 4/5 of the ex-CNDP have chosen not to join the rebellion. In recent months, M23 has increasingly claimed that they want a review of the discredited 2011 presidential elections in an attempt to attract sympathies of a broader constituency. Nevertheless, the CNDP political party had in fact joined the President's Electoral Alliance, and many top M23 commanders orchestrated massive fraud on his behalf. Now, if it's not really the claims of the March 23, 2009 agreement, or good governance, human rights, then what does Rwanda really want in this crisis? Despite the extremist paranoia about balkanization, which has been so prevalent for many years amongst the Congolese population traumatized by multiple foreign invasions, only one of the rebel demands has any lasting explanatory power, and that is federalism. Rwandan orchestration of the M23 rebellion becomes more comprehensible when understood as a determined and calculated drive to spawn the creation of an autonomous federal state for the eastern Congo. There has been speculation over whether Rwandan involvement was driven by security interests, economic interests, or cultural ties. But a federal state for the eastern Congo would encapsulate all of these issues. Prior to the November 2011 elections, one of the most senior Rwandan intelligence officers argued that because the Congo was too big to be governed by Kinshasa, Rwanda should support the emergence of a federal state for the Eastern Congo. He told me Goma should relate to Kinshasa in the same way that Juba was linked to Khartoum, in reference to Sudan. During our official meetings with the Rwandan government in Kigali in July, the Rwandan delegation consistently stated that our investigations were simply a distraction from reaching the definitive solution for governance in the Eastern Congo. When pushed further, several representatives did not hide the fact that the only solution they had in mind was indeed federalism. Not surprisingly, Rwanda has openly aided and abetted self-declared Congolese secessionists so as to set the bar high enough to position federalism eventually as an acceptable compromise. During several internal meetings of M23 for mobilization, senior government officials, including the Minister of Defense Special Assistant, openly affirmed that establishing this autonomous state was in fact the key goal of the rebellion. One M23 spokesperson recently stated to the New York Times, "We want more than decentralization. We want federalism. The eastern parts of the Congo's interests are in Eastern Africa." Even senior Ugandan security officials also acknowledged that this was the aim of the Rwandans in this M23 war. One officer who was himself involved in supporting M23 in cooperation with the Rwandans told us, "They're thinking big. You need to look at South Sudan." This objective also explains why Rwanda has consistently sought to depict all armed groups in the eastern DRC as one single, united, credible front against Kinshasa, and repeatedly calling the Congo a big black void and the Congolese state as fictitious. A federal autonomous state for the Eastern Congo would cement and guarantee Rwanda's already extensive influence over military, political, economic, and cultural aspects of life. The government of Rwanda, to its great credit, since the horrific events of the genocide in 1994, has exhibited unparalleled ambition to rebuild its country with unmatched progress. However, that same determination has led Rwanda's leaders to erroneously adopt this inherently destabilizing long-term geopolitical strategy for the Eastern DRC. So, if Rwanda's geopolitical aspirations are indeed, as I suspect, so ambitious, then what can we expect from current negotiations, particularly when Rwanda has demonstrated in recent weeks that it has the upper hand on the battlefield? For his part, President Kabila feels very strongly about negotiating the March 23rd agreement, but talks will inevitably falter unless the key issue of federalism is put front and center on the negotiating agenda. Will the U.S. and others in the international community support a federal solution for the Eastern Congo, with full knowledge that this was likely Rwanda's primary objective in the first place? Stepping back from the current dynamics, federalism in and of itself is neither inherently a good or bad proposition, but when driven by a neighboring state which would benefit enormously from it, federalism can be problematic, to say the least. Diplomats commonly affirm that Rwanda can and must be a part of a solution. Which solution, I would ask? The Rwandan solution for this crisis appears to have been identified well before the shots were even fired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to share the findings of the group and my personal perspectives on the crisis.
For your testimony. And now, Mr. Prendergast.
Thanks very much, Representatives Smith and Bass and Marino and Turner, for your extraordinary commitment to the people of the Congo. Deeply appreciated by everyone in this room, I can tell you. I want to begin, though, by echoing something you said, Congressman Smith, earlier in the hearing. No one is questioning the hard work and the dedication, the decades-long commitment that key administration officials have exhibited on behalf of peace in Congo. I would particularly point out, for special commendation, Ambassador Johnnie Carson and Ambassador Susan Rice at the UN. I'm particularly saddened by the personal attacks we've seen against Ambassador Rice in the press and the blogosphere over the last couple of weeks over issues related to the Congo. The Washington shark cage has been fully activated, and I guess some people see blood in the water. But knowing Johnnie and Susan and working with them for over the past 16 years, I can tell you from personal experience that they've worked tirelessly for peace in the Great Lakes. Reasonable people, however, can disagree over tactics and over strategy. And it is in that spirit that I deliver my testimony today. I'm going to focus my remarks on issues related to the Congolese peace process in the interest of a division of labor amongst my colleagues here at the table. Throughout the latest Congolese conflagration and previous cycles of conflict there, the root causes of war have not been addressed, leaving these peace processes, the endless peace process, to focus on flimsy power-sharing deals and arrangements that have undermined the sovereignty of the Congolese state and the professionalism and neutrality of its armed forces. This in turn has left the civil population of eastern Congo subjected to globally unparalleled violence, predation, and impoverishment. Another unrepresentative agreement between powerful interests with the biggest guns that we may see coming out of this Kampala talks might ease open fighting momentarily, but it lays a deeper foundation for further devastation and state deconstruction down the road. The United States should not be a party to such a short-term and destructive approach and must alter its policy to help avert an outcome that simply sows the seeds for further war. This hearing and your leadership, I believe, here in Congress will be an important building block for the kind of step change that we're seeking from the administration and the broader international community. Here's the crux of it. The lack, I think, of a credible and effective and internationally mandated and leveraged peace process addressing these issues in eastern Congo is becoming a major reason for that war's continuation. The current negotiation in Kampala between the governments of Congo and the government of Congo and the M23 rebels is already making the same mistakes as its predecessor processes and will likely result in the same kind of short-term deal that keeps the Congolese government in power, reduces international pressure on Rwanda and Uganda for backing the M23, and redivides the spoils of war. The root causes of structural violence will remain unaddressed, and any agreement will lack the involvement of political parties, of representative civil society elements, including women and religious leaders, and local armed groups representing the diverse voices and interests of eastern Congo. The time has come finally for a real international peace effort, the kind that actually has a chance of ending the deadliest war globally since World War II. And the U.S. needs to help make that happen, because if it's left solely to the combatants and their regional sponsors, it will not. We believe that two key pieces of the solution are missing now. For a lasting peace, a process needs to address those fundamental root causes rooted in economic and political drivers of war. First, the economic. A shared framework for the future must be agreed upon, in which the entire sub-region of Central Africa, Congo first and foremost and at the center, can benefit much more from peaceful, legal natural resource development rather than the violent, illegal extraction that exists today. Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank bill, which this Congress heroically passed in the face of a lot of industry money and lobbying, a nascent regional certification effort, initiatives by some of the forward-leaning companies, electronics companies who have started working in support of real progressive change, and then new OECD guidelines. These are all catalyzing movement in the right direction, but more must be done to change the economic incentives from war to peace, just as cleaning up the blood diamond trade helped incentivize peace in West African countries. Coupled with strong international investment, these efforts will create the conditions, I think, for transparent and effective governing institutions. Dealing with the economic roots of war not only removes the main driver for the conflict today, but creates the main engine for state reconstruction. Second, the politics. A political framework for Congo must be agreed upon that restores public confidence and brings back the viability of the Congolese state, while ensuring that further rebellion does not ensue. President Kabila faces a political crisis as a result of the failures of the army and of the elections last year, and the talks with M23 alone will only erode his authority and provide further insult and injury to the Congolese people. It is now time for a wider inter-Congolese dialogue in which leaders from the government, from political parties, and from throughout civil society across Congo actively participate and decide on a national consensus on reforms on key issues such as the political framework for the country, decentralization, protection of minorities, the return of refugees, and other issues that would be put on the table by the Congolese themselves. I have 5 recommendations for strengthening U.S. policy, some of which are echoing some of the good points that you all at the congressional table raised earlier. The first one and foremost, I think, is the need to appoint this presidential envoy. And I say presidential because it needs to have that kind of rank. The current U.S. policy structure simply doesn't allow the United States to exercise its latent leverage, its creativity, and the international coordinating function with respect to supporting peace in Congo that we should be playing. If you appoint a presidential envoy, that helps to rectify those problems. The envoy should be a high-level individual with experience and relationships in the region, who will be responsible for developing a unified policy, the step change we're talking about, towards the regional crisis, and be able to fully invest in helping to deepen this peace process to address its current gaping deficiencies. Such an envoy, we hope, would leverage America's economic, political, and military influence to ensure that all parties fully cooperate with the international political process and work closely with the AU and the UN and the ICGLR. The second recommendation is one that everyone seems to be for, but it's not happening. That is to get a UN envoy out there as soon as possible. Everyone is saying that they want this, including we just heard from Ambassador Carson very encouragingly. But it wasn't in the United Nations Security Council resolution last week. The congressional letter that Congresswoman Bass referred to earlier couldn't be better timed in that regard. Both of these envoys will be appointed only, I think, if the Congress stays on this case and demands that we see these kinds of things happen. The third recommendation, again, I'm echoing. We want to support robust United Nations sanctions against key people. The international community, I think, and this is terribly important for the peace process and for forward movement, we're leaving a huge reservoir of leverage on the table by not following the recommendations of the UN group of experts and others. There must be accountability for those who have restarted Congo's war and for those who are orchestrating or funding crimes against humanity and war crimes. As a responsible supporter of the United Nations sanctions regime, the United States should be compelled to push to impose sanctions on all individuals identified in the UN group of experts, final report, and those individuals and entities that are supporting the criminal networks, the mafia networks, through the trade in natural resources. This won't happen, I do not believe, if Congress doesn't continue to pound away on this issue. So I think progress is in part in your hands. The fourth recommendation I would put forward is the importance, and this was well articulated in the discussion, I think, between Ambassador Carson and the congresspersons on the panel. We need to suspend certain U.S. assistance to any government supporting conflict and obstructing peace. That's military assistance for sure, but there are certain categories of bilateral non-military assistance and particularly multilateral assistance, non-humanitarian aid to governments, whoever they are, who are supporting conflict in eastern Congo. Now, for example, if Rwanda and Uganda are found to be continuing their support for M23 and are supporting M23 efforts to obstruct peace process, progress at the peace table, then corresponding measures should be taken by the U.S., other partner governments, and multilateral organizations to which the U.S. contributes huge amounts of American taxpayers' dollars. Let's be clear about this aid. We don't want health and education and microenterprise, the kind of small-scale assistance that goes to the people of Rwanda, to be stopped. That aid should continue, I believe, but it's the budget support and the military assistance, those two categories of aid that are critical. And it's the World Bank. The World Bank has $135 million on the table right now in budget support for the Rwandan government. That should not be dispersed until we get clear forward movement on the peace process in Congo. Fifth and finally, and this one hasn't been discussed yet, but we would call for a high-level summit on responsible investing in the Great Lakes. The United States, in partnership with the European Union, the African Union, could facilitate an international investment conference on investing in peace mines rather than the conflict minerals that exist today, in order to help expand the pie in the region for conflict resolution and for development in which all the people of the sub-region can benefit, particularly, and at the center, the people of the Congo. The summit could focus on developing market-based opportunities for responsible investment in Congo and the region. Again, we got to turn those incentives away from illegal, extractive, violent mining to peaceful, legal development that that goes into the treasury and funds development in Eastern Congo. Bob Hormats, Undersecretary of State in the administration, could be a kind of person who could help spearhead that, as someone who has helped build this public-private alliance that involves companies and the United States government and civil society trying to help promote responsible investment, spurred on by 1502 from the Dodd-Frank law. In conclusion, my bottom line is this, in 2 sentences. A credible, internationally driven peace process that deals with the root causes and includes broader Eastern Congolese civil society won't absolutely guarantee peace, but its absence, however, absolutely guarantees war. Thank you very much.
Very much, Mr. Prendergast. Mr. Dizalela.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the Subcommittee on Africa, thank you for the invitation and honor to testify before your committee. I come before you as a Congolese and concerned U.S. citizen. The views I expressed today in the statement are mine and mine alone. This important hearing comes at yet another critical time for the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I'd like to commend you for your interest in my home country. Congo is too big to fail, and the U.S. should care today for the same strategic and security reasons it did during the Cold War. With its mineral and other natural wealth, DRC is the equivalent of the world's breadbasket of critical resources. At this time of Chinese scramble for resources, we cannot stand idle and let Uganda and Rwanda destabilize the heart of Africa. Measured in human lives, the cost of the military adventurism, which has indirectly killed over 6 million Congolese, now rivals King Leopold's Holocaust. Ironically, Rwandan President Paul Kagame blames King Leopold for the current crisis. Substantial U.S. military assistance to Rwanda and Uganda, and Washington's reluctance to denounce and stop its support for these regimes makes the U.S. an accomplice to the tragedy. Today, the greatest challenge and obstacle to resolving the crisis in Congo is neither the confusing alphabet soup of militia names, nor the lack of engagement of the international community. Rather, it is the lack of understanding of the drivers and dynamics of the conflict that stands between policymakers like yourselves and the right prescriptions. For 2 decades, the policy discourse on DRC has been defined by a narrative that focuses on the ramification of the problem, such as ethnic identity, citizenship issues, sexual violence, looting of natural resources, but ignores the root causes of the crisis. While the problem is often viewed as a humanitarian disaster, which it is, DRC is paralyzed by political crisis, which requires political solutions, and that's where you can have the greatest impact. Congo has been muddling through a series of crises for nearly 2 decades. The causes, of course, are well known. An inept government with a weak leadership, no articulated vision, no legitimacy after the botched 2011 election, lack of capacity to resist or contain predatory designs of neighbors, i.e. Rwanda, Uganda, and Angola, proliferation of armed groups, and an underachieving and over-politicized UN peacekeeping mission. This cocktail of problems is topped by an apathetic diplomatic community motivated by short-term interests of the country to represent rather than the long-term stabilization of Congo and Central Africa. So the M23 rebellion is to be understood through this optic. As the M23 crisis enters a new phase with the withdrawal of the rebels from the battered city of Goma, the people of North Kivu and their fellow Congolese citizens everywhere wonder whether the storm has passed or the rebels retreat to present the quiet before a superstorm. Either way, telltale signs and history indicate that the conflict will continue unless appropriate deterring measures are taken. M23, like its precursor, CNDP of Laurent Nkunda, and the dozen armed groups roaming the hills of eastern Congo, expose Congo as a dysfunctional state with weak political leadership and lacking a competent army and security institutions. With the failing of the state, old latent community grievances stemming from land disputes, demographic pressures, ethnic tensions, and control of resources and trading routes has turned Eastern Congo into a tinderbox. This means that ambitious war entrepreneurs and demagogues only need a cause and find a sponsor. It can be a community, a business, political elite, or a state to start a militia. The M23, which is primarily a Tutsi mono-ethnic armed group, sought to exploit these dormant grievances, citing discrimination against Tutsis as one reason for the rebellion. But they failed to generate support from important Tutsi communities, such as the Banyamulenge, who have so far refused to join M23. Instead, the Banyamulenge are serving with the DRC army and fighting the rebellion. The rebellion had also threatened to take over Goma and march on Kinshasa and liberate DRC. But when Goma fell to M23 element, spontaneous protests broke out in Bukavu, in Kisangani, and Kinshasa, denouncing Kinshasa's failure to protect the city and exposing even a greater hire against the rebellion and the United Nations Stabilization Mission, MONUSCO. While it may be too early to draw meaningful conclusions, M23's failure to rally other Tutsis who had previously presented a common front may signal the beginning of a new era of trust building between ethnic groups. After 2 presidential and legislative elections that empowered the Congolese to seek change through the ballot instead of at the barrel of the gun, M23 has no popular appeal. But the highly controversial and contested 2011 presidential legislative elections eroded the legitimacy of President Kabila, making it impossible for the government to mobilize the masses in this time of crisis. M23 rebellion further exacerbated the legitimacy crisis by exposing the state's inability to protect its citizens. The government failed to build a professional army, perhaps the single most important element in ensuring Congo's territorial integrity and the security of its citizens and coveted natural resources. Without such a competent military, DRC is unable to stop the proliferation of militias. Instead, the government of DRC has chosen to compromise with militiamen and co-opt them into the national army with no disruption of their ranks and files. The lack of an adequate military integration program has resulted in the establishment of parallel command and structures in the national army. This means that the militia who join the national army remain in their areas of control and keep their command nearly intact. This arrangement allows the former militiamen to perpetrate abuses on the civilian populations and keep their access to local resources, all under the protection of a Congolese military uniform. This integration model enabled disgruntled ex-CNDP element stationed in North and South Kivu to mutiny and launch M23, when DRC, ironically, sought to arrest their commander, General Bosco Ntaganda. The predatory designs of neighboring Rwanda and Uganda also fuel the volatile situation, as we've heard before. Both Rwanda and Uganda have invaded Congo twice, with continued incursion into eastern Congo, where they still support militias. Several UN reports, we heard Steve a few minutes ago, several UN reports have linked both countries to Congolese militias and the looting of resources. And of course, now they link to M23. Both countries have denied the charges and insist that they are wrongfully accused and used as a scapegoat for DRC government failures. Their denial and deceit, however, undermine the chances for lasting peace. It is impossible to solve the crisis when the parties to the conflict refuse to assume their share of responsibility. When you invade your neighbor twice, arm militias, support rebellions, loot resources, and indirectly cause the death of over 6 million Congolese, you are not an scapegoat. You are a serious problem. So we know the primary supporters of the militias, and whether they be in Congo or in neighboring countries or overseas. We also know the primary routes of explicit, this illicit export route, which neighbors profit from. So what should the U.S. do? I think that's probably what's the most interest to you. Number one, we need to unequivocally support security sector reform, for the reasons we've heard today, from my colleagues and from the Assistant Secretary. Reform is long overdue, but reform means serious commitment to rebuilding a new army and not cobbling together old militias and new units. Millions of dollars have been invested in training, but not enough attention has been devoted to the reconstruction of the military. Unfortunately, these initiatives amount to very expensive window dressing. For instance, the Belgian-trained elite unit that fought M23 early in the spring did not receive the institutional support they needed to succeed in their mission. US AFRICOM has also trained a unit which could have made a positive contribution in North Kivu in another context, had the leadership and the structure been different. The current broken military structure cannot absorb newly trained units effectively. Real military reform requires that we break down the old, decrepit foundation and build a new army from scratch. And such reform process will phase out and discharge top commanders who came from militias, as well as former militiamen who now fill their ranks. We cannot put new wine in old vases. They will break. So number two, we need to implement US law. In the Congolese, like many other people in the world, look up to the US as a beacon of principles and leadership. So there is a law passed by then Senator Barack Obama. We had mentioned that already, the Democratic Republic of Congo Relief, Security and Democracy Promotion Act. These bills include provision on conflict mineral, sexual violence, sanction on armed group and the state sponsors. And so far, we have hardly scratched the surface of this law. It still baffles people. It definitely baffles the Congolese. Number three, we need to activate the State Department Reward to Justice program. I think we need to encourage associates of militias who are trying to get out of the system to turn on their colleagues who are keeping them in the system. It is very much like a gang mentality where once you're in, it becomes very difficult to get out, especially if that's based on ethnic affiliation. Number four, we need to apply sanctions against individual and institution identified in the report. I commend the US government and the Congress for the recent initiative that they're taking to sanction leaders of M23. But it will not serve the intended purpose. If we sanction Makenga, we sanction Bosco Ntaganda or anybody else, and do not sanction the backers in Rwanda or Uganda or where else they may be, then the game will continue. If Makenga becomes a burden, he will be replaced. When Kunda became a burden, he was arrested and replaced with Bosco. So tomorrow it will be somebody else. And I think we cannot act like we were doing something impactful when in fact we are just again doing window dressing, like with security sector reform. And then number five, we need to push for the completion of the electoral process and opening of the political system. We've talked about Rwanda and Uganda, but the bigger elephant is really Kinshasa. Yeah. Eastern Congo often is discussed as if it was a country. Eastern Congo is not a country, it is part of a larger country called Congo. The crisis that is taking place in the Kivus, in Eastern Congo, have the roots in Kinshasa. It's the failure of that leadership. And for the last 5 years, in 2006 and 2011, the Congolese have been emboldened with the electoral process. We have not stood, meaning the international community, has not stood up with the Congolese to fight that. So we need to open that process so that the botched electoral system should move forward. We need to support the holding of the municipal and provincial elections. At this point, both the National Senate and the Electoral Commission are serving without any mandate. So until that happens, we have a system that has no legitimacy. Then last, we need to insist on restructuring the Independent National Electoral Commission. They were part of the problem. We looked the other way when the system was botched. We cannot move on without this. This is why President Kabila cannot really speak with the backing of his people. This is where when people riot against M23, they also automatically riot against Kabila. And that cannot continue. Then finally, I would like simply to say that this conflict has gone too long. It's gone on too long. It challenges now our morals and principles as a country. We cannot talk about democracy. We cannot be outraged about sexual violence when in fact we're not taking the steps to stop this. In Congo, armed groups and the international backers and their international local backers are the enemies. But there's even a greater enemy, and the greater enemy is the Congolese government in its failure. it's also the Congolese army, which itself is a big tapestry of different militias. So when you're in Congo and you see, if you want to talk about insecurity, I define insecurity as the feeling you have in your gut when you see somebody in uniform in front of you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Dizalili, thank you so very much for your testimony. All three of your testimonies were extraordinarily incisive, certainly timely, and prescribed a way forward for the administration as well as for Congress. So for that, our subcommittee is deeply grateful for your presence here today and for sharing with us not only an understanding of the situation on the ground, but what ought to be done perhaps to truly rectify it. I think the emphasis on root causes couldn't be more timely as well. I think, Mr. Hege, you know, I'll never forget years ago, in the early days of the war in Yugoslavia, I, along with Congressman Frank Wolf, went to Vukovar and other places in Croatia after it had been devastated. And then we went to Belgrade and met with Slobodan Milosevic and others within that dictatorial government of his. And I'll never forget getting a map of a greater Serbia that included Bosnia and Croatia, and the lack of understanding on all of our part about what the end game was appalling. We thought this was something that would abate over a short period of time, and I think, Mr. Hege, your point about the key goal of establishing an autonomous state is largely underappreciated, and perhaps our other two distinguished witnesses might want to speak about that. But you point out that Rwanda's deeply ingrained federalist vision is born out of the geopolitical regional strategy adopted by Kigali's leadership. A federal autonomous state for the Eastern Congo would cement and guarantee Rwanda's already extensive influence over military, political, economic, and cultural aspects of life. And I think that is underappreciated almost in the extreme as to the why of it. Why did we know the mineral wealth is an engraved invitation to looters and thieves to do what they do. But this idea that it is part of a government overall strategy, perhaps you might want to elaborate on that, and as well as our other very distinguished witnesses.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the question of the Rwandan strategy for creating or spawning an autonomous state for the Eastern Congo, a few things that I'd like to mention as well in terms of timing. Some of my colleagues here have mentioned the cyclical nature and the numbers of wars that have taken place in Eastern Congo. It appears that the Rwandan backers of M23, the real masterminds that orchestrated the creation of the rebellion, were looking towards the post-electoral period precisely for the reasons that Mbemba described, the discredited 2011 presidential elections as a period where they would be able to mobilize an Eastern common front against a delegitimized Kinshasa and President Kabila himself. This was certainly a part of their calculations about why to push for this now. Also, the question of the CNDP's cycles of impunity and the fact that the international community was increasingly resistant to allowing their capacity to control parallel chains of command, to have access, unfettered access to illegal trade in natural resources. They understood that this was a time in which those networks could be curtailed, that Kinshasa could attempt to curtail them, and that they would need to capitalize on those assets before any of those individuals were eventually redeployed out of the Kivus, or in the case of Bosco Ntaganda, that he would have been arrested himself. The third element that I think that they took into account in preparing this strategy, because it was quite well prepared, we have extensive evidence that shows Makenga himself, back all the way in 2011, was amassing large amounts of weapons at his home and in numerous arms caches in preparation for a return to war precisely after the elections. But the Rwandans also understood that there was a generalized Congo fatigue, as it's often described, that there's a sentiment that Congo is sort of always a mess, President Kagame, I've been told by Rwandan diplomats, likes to say that that the Congo has been a mess before he was born and will be a mess infinitely or indefinitely. Certainly within the UN, there are member states that are questioning the strategy on the Congo. How long can they continue to foot the bill for a peacekeeping mission, which is so costly? And should we start to think of more radical solutions, definitive long-term solutions for the Eastern Congo, and whether the current governance structure is a viable one? And I think that Rwanda felt that that was a right period to push for this, and that unfortunately their success on the battlefield recently would likely embolden them to continue to drive for this endgame. And any other issues, smokescreen issues on the table in political talks would only prolong this process until they can get to that key and core issue.
I want to add to what Steve said, and then Vemba will have something too, of course. I'll do my 3 points: security interests, economic interests, and political interests that the governments of Rwanda and Uganda have in Eastern Congo, and why there continues to be intervention, both direct and indirect, by the neighboring governments in Eastern Congo. Security first. Rwanda legitimately concerned over the last 18 years since 1994 about the possible strengthening of the FDLR. They want to ensure, without any doubt, that the FDLR cannot come back and threaten Rwanda. And then in that context can't allow a strong Congolese state that might provide support to the FDLR. For the Ugandans, they'll say it's the ADF. And we've heard already some back and forth with Ambassador Carson and the committee on that. There's a second issue, the economic issues, that I think are deeper than the security ones. Rwanda has benefited massively over the last decade from the looting of natural resources in Eastern Congo, particularly, and this is why this whole campaign in the United States has unfolded, particularly amongst young people on college campuses, this conflict minerals campaign, because everyone is somehow complicit in this. All of us that buy cell phones and laptops and other electronics instruments are helping to underwrite this smuggling network and these competing mafias that are ruining and continue to immiserate the people of Eastern Congo. Tin, tantalum, and tungsten are the 3 minerals today. There were others decades ago, and going all the way back to King Leopold. That looting that goes across borders that benefits us with no protections for the Congolese people. It's a huge windfall for Rwanda. Foreign exchange, balance of payments, all the rest of it drives their economic development miracle, post-genocide economic miracle. In Uganda, it's gold. It's smuggled gold. Huge amounts of gold travel across the border illegally from Congo into Uganda and then exported out of the country. And these are again windfalls that are hard to replace by domestic economic development. Then the third arena, the third issue is political. Both Uganda and Rwanda, I think the bottom line, want proxies in positions in Eastern Congo, whether they're military or civilian authorities, to ensure their economic and security interests. So when President Kabila tried after the elections to redeploy the CNDP elements, as Ambassador Carson was describing, he described all the facts of what happened, but what was underneath the facts, I think, was that the CNDP had established for years with Rwanda and Uganda, particularly Rwandan support, this ability to export illegally and extract natural resources and ensure the political and security interests of the state of Rwanda. And so when President Kabila tried to redeploy these forces out of that region, which would have undermined that control, that proxy control that the neighboring countries have over the politics and the economics of the East, the rebellion immediately occurred because they couldn't allow that to happen. So, of course, Rwandan support comes pouring into the formation of the M23. They changed the acronyms. It's the same group. Whittled down, though, Vemba's points are very important about the lack of any kind of domestic constituency that that the M23 have. But nevertheless, the result is the same. It's more destabilization, more instability, and then allowing those that have powerful proxies inside Eastern Congo to profit from that destabilization.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple points. One is on the peacekeeping mission. I mean, we've brought MONUSCO a few times today. I think MONUSCO is now part of the problem. Okay? It becomes an enabler to insecurity, just like Rwanda and Uganda and the government in Kinshasa, in the sense that, you know, part of the challenge when we look at Congo, a lot of people discover Congo with 94 genocide in Rwanda. But Congo existed way before that. Those of us who were born there and grew up there knew a country that worked. So when we go to Congo today, we don't recognize this country. That does not mean the people are not capable. Some of you are old enough to remember the first UN mission in Congo, ONUC. ONUC was much more bolder, robust, but also very determined to carry out its mandate. It lasted only 4 years. The war in 1960 was much bigger than what we're seeing today. You had Che Guevara show up in Congo. You had the Chinese, you had the Egyptian, you had the French mercenary, the Belgian who went in Katanga. But because ONUC was really committed in helping the Congolese meet up the obligation to protect their country and build it together, they fought, they protected the civilians, and they allowed then Colonel Mobutu to build an army that eventually became the army that the US relied on in Angola, in Chad, when somehow Congo was your strategic ally. I'm not sure what happened. But so simply to mean that we need to scale down on MONUSCO mandate very quickly, make it very clear how much longer they're going to stay in Congo and what their mission should be, so that the Kinshasa government does not lean on the UN for excuses. So let me illustrate. If 200 women are raped in some hamlets in North Kivu, the headlines in New York Times will say so many women were raped, incensed, but the blame will fall on the UN first. They will say there was a contingent of Bangladeshi troops around, they didn't do anything. Nobody will ask, where was the Congolese army? And we can do that because there is a force there that's supposed to help, but it's fallen much shorter. The UN has failed to protect civilians throughout this entire M23 event. They fell in Bunagana, but the press was not there to report it, so they cannot just live with M23. When Ruchuru and Kiwanja fell, MONUSCO forgot that in 2008 there had been massacres there by CNDP. They didn't do anything. They said, we will absolutely protect Goma. Goma will not fall. Well, then when Goma fell, they said we didn't fight because we don't endanger civilians. And then when M23 withdrew and they raided Kibumba and Kibati IDP camps, the UN was nowhere to be seen. So going on in 2 decades, the UN is not a solution for the DRC. Thank you very much.
Ms. Bass?
I'm going to unfortunately have to leave at this point, but I want to thank you all for your testimony and the time you took out to come, and I look forward to continue to work with you, and especially to follow up on what we can specifically do here in Congress, and most interested in the notion of sanctions and also sanctions on individuals and how that might work and how we might get that started from here. So thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Marino.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Most of us in the room here know at least one measure that must be taken against Rwanda and Uganda, and that is the enactment of serious, stinging sanctions. However, and let's call this the way it is, you know, the Obama administration refuses to engage in serious monetary sanctions against these countries. And this is not atypical in other foreign affairs matters that plague the world today with this administration. So my simple question is, what do you propose that we do or that you can do to persuade this administration to enforce these sanctions the way that it's been so eloquently stated here today from you gentlemen and from this panel. So you can start, Mr. Hege, and each one of you, could you respond to that, please?
Sure, I can speak from the perspective of the group of experts. We submit annually a list of recommended individuals and entities for consideration before the UN Sanctions Committee. Obviously, the United States government plays an important role in taking forward and studying those names. Many of those names, while the list remains confidential, many of those names are included in our public reports. So there's not a great deal of surprise of the contents of that list. However, the group itself steps away from the consideration and discussions of the list that it provides. So in essence, we remain sort of indifferent to the steps that are taken subsequently. However, I can say, having stepped away from my role in the group of experts, that measures to identify the individuals and sanction individuals who are externally supporting M23, and in our conclusions are not necessarily just externally supporting, they're actually commanding and running the rebellion in its day-to-day activities, which goes beyond external support in many cases. That measures to identify them, be that sanctions, be that diplomatic pressure, all of that is critically important in identifying the problem. As I said, Rwanda continues to identify itself as the solution. However, sanctions or efforts to identify publicly the individuals running the rebellion in the Rwandan government would go a long way to ensuring that the problem is squarely understood as a Rwandan orchestration, as a Rwandan-driven and commanded rebellion, and that will have enormously important consequences for any peace negotiations in terms of framing the issue and not necessarily getting lost in, as I said, some of the smokescreen issues that have been post facto used as pretext to justify the rebellion. So I would encourage any of those measures and any symbolic efforts that can be made to ensure that the problem itself is squarely identified as a Rwandan-driven rebellion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Prendergast.
Thank you. There's been an amazing amount of continuity, I think, in U.S. policy going back to the Clinton administration, Bush administration, Obama administration. All three very, very slow to utilize pressures.
Agreed.
And it's been an incentive-based policy. This is a long-term problem. A belief, I think, fundamentally, we heard it from Ambassador Carson today very clearly, a belief in quiet diplomacy and in direct engagement, it's what I would call in the conflict resolution theory an insider partial model that has been pursued. And I think the response to that, I'll give my recommendations as to what Congress can do to help the situation, and then say what we can do as civil society groups. On the congressional side, I think publicizing the failure of this 15-year policy. Again, what has been so effective about Congress's work has been bipartisan. The failure has largely been bipartisan, so a bipartisan effort in Congress saying it's not working, we need to do something differently is crucial. That can be done through the media and through, I think, the direct contact with administration officials. The letter that is circulating, there are numerous, I think, initiatives both in the Senate and the House right now attempting potentially to pass a quick resolution before the end of the term. There are various things that could be done to put this very clearly on the public record, this 15-year failure of constructive engagement, which is where we're going now, as we can bring that kind of terminology that has been used in other contexts and talk about this. We need to utilize those sticks. For our part, the NGO community, the civil society community, the letter that was cited by Congressman Smith at the opening is an example of how groups that work on all kinds of different issues internationally are coming together and saying, let's unify our voices around a certain set of points and an agenda that can press the administration to become more bold in its approach. And we will undertake, as will other groups, the Enough Project and many other groups, a series of campaigns going out, particularly to young people, to faith-based groups and others who actually care about what's happening in the Congo, and that I think constituency of conscience is actually expanding fairly rapidly on Congo, just as we saw in 2003, 4, 5 on Darfur. We're starting to see that now in Congo. And the more, I think, the more Americans care about what's happening to the people of Congo and say, you know what, the status quo is just simply unacceptable in U.S. policy, the more I think we'll have a shot at altering that status quo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Marino. I think that's an important question. I think all of us today who spoke to you, including Ambassador Carson, mentioned all the ingredients that need to be put in place. I think on one side you have the government that refuses to call a spade. So we talk about external threat, external support. If it's external, then we know where it's coming from. We should be able to name it. But I think we've talked about everything. So personally, I would say one recommendation in order to put the U.S. Congress has always been at the forefront of certain watershed events in Congo and Africa. So it was this House that passed the anti-apartheid bill. It was this House that supported the emergence of the democracy movement across Africa in the 80s. So I think Chairman was around. So I think one recommendation I'll say, because Africa is always a very bipartisan area, maybe you should consider passing a more robust version of the Obama law here that you can push then to be applied, because I'm not sure if the White House, if the State Department is shying away for that and decide to hide behind the economic or the miracle of the Rwandan recovery. It's very troubling, because this really what happened with King Leopold. He was the great philanthropist. He was bringing civilization to those savages in Congo. He was saving them from slave traders. Look at this great global trade outpost called Congo. But then, behind the shadow of that civilizing mission, we were chopping people's limbs, killing people, 10 million of them. So something similar is happening today. We have laws on the books. We have people who are speaking. We have good people like yourself listening to us, but nothing is happening. So I think you have community leaders like John who have rallied thousands or millions of young people to push causes. You've been listening to us. Then I think we need your support so that the other side can start listening to what we ask, because the ingredients are already there. Thank you very much.
I think I'm right in saying that you do agree with me, each of you, that the previous administrations and this administration know what the facts are, know what's going on. I mean, they're not ignorant to these facts. I mean, it's very blatant. But they chose and choose not to do what should be done about this. So, Mr. Prendergast, I think you're absolutely right in getting more people involved, particularly young people. I'm a freshman next year. I'm coming back as a sophomore. My daughter and I had the opportunity to visit the continent of Africa. We went to Liberia and Ghana. And my daughter's going to be a physician. But she said, Dad, we have to take care of these people. We have to help them. And if we do not do it, who is going to? So it's like banging my head against the wall sometimes. I've signed numerous letters that have been sent to the administration and the secretaries. We never get a response from it. So maybe we do have to take this with more passion to the public to get our government to respond to it. And you can be assured that my daughter and I will be there doing it. Thank you. I yield back.
Very much, Mr. Marino. Let me just ask one final question, and then I'll leave any final comments to our three distinguished witnesses. Mr. Hege, there's been reports that at least one UN Security Council member wanted to delay the report on Eastern Congo this summer, and perhaps even lessen its criticism of the role played by Rwanda. Can you definitively tell us, is that true or not?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We submitted a interim report during the month of May, which did not include information regarding arms embargo violations committed by the government of Rwanda, precisely because those violations had just really manifested themselves more overtly. However, we briefed the Sanctions Committee of the information we had gathered in June, and suggested that we provide an additional annex to that report, that interim report, outlining the violations of the arms embargo by the government of Rwanda. The committee requested that we engage once again with the government of Rwanda, although we had already gone to Kigali in May to meet with them over a period of 3 days, during which they refused to accept us for any substantive meetings. We remained in our hotel room for those 3 days. The committee asked us to provide, particularly the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Rwandan Minister of Foreign Affairs, at the time was coming to New York at the end of June. I personally met with her in New York. I presented to her our work, our methodology, our approach, the reason why this information had not been included in the interim report. I outlined in detail our findings, and at that stage, she declined to provide any response, explanation, or justification of our findings. As such, we proceeded to submit that document, and it was then made public as an addendum and not an annex to our interim report. So the answer to your question is yes, as a committee, the consensus of the committee was that Rwanda, the Rwandan government, its request to have an additional right of reply should be granted by the group, and out of good faith in working for and under the guidance of the Sanctions Committee, we provided them with that opportunity. They declined to provide any right of reply, and unfortunately proceeded to make public statements that nevertheless they had never been provided a right of reply, which for us obviously is quite frustrating, given that we purposefully delayed the submission of that information in order to engage in this dialogue with the government of Rwanda. So we, as I said, proceeded to submit that, and that report then was published at the end of June.
Thank you. Any final comments from any of our distinguished witnesses?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just want to mention two things. I originally at the outset said Congo is too big to fail. There are quarters of enlightened people, smart people. You know, a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times ran a piece saying Congo should be split in half or in various portions. Anybody who entertains that idea is smoking something. Because if Rwanda, as small as it is, has trouble, we know Rwanda will be the ideal country if I was a leader. Everybody speaks the same language, they have the same name, they have two castes, the Hutu and the Tutsis. But then they've been killing each other over and over. If Rwanda thinks, or anybody thinks Rwanda can control the Kivus, then we've not seen half of it. The Kivus are not Rwanda. It's not the same makeup. They don't know these people. The Rwandan tried to march all the way to Kinshasa, and they were kicked out of Kinshasa by the civilians in '98, which led them to do the rebellion in '96. So this is an idea that we should resist by all means. So anybody who's entertained that will have blood on his hands, and he doesn't know the half of it. Number two, I think we need to stand for something. And the DRC, the people of Congo, have already rallied around the democratic principles. They're waiting for your support. The Congolese don't need help changing things. They need help to push the process along. They're very capable people. They're resourceful. And I'd like, on their behalf, to thank you for your continuous interest on their plight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just my last point there, Congressman Smith, would be that, and Congressman Marino, would be that we have today, I think, a clash of two visions of policy. One vision is a belief that I think we need to encourage the neighboring countries of the Congo to become part of a solution, and thus sanctions and aid cutoffs and those kind of things punitive measures would undermine our influence. So that would be, I think, at this juncture, what the administration and past administrations have pursued vis-a-vis Congo and the continuous intervention cycles that we've seen from the region. The alternative belief that I think this table has articulated, and the committee, key members of your committee have articulated as well, is that these kinds of punitive measures, which, by the way, involve withholding hard-earned U.S. taxpayer dollars for the kinds of support that are fungible, military and budgetary support. We're not talking again about the development and humanitarian assistance that goes straight to the people of Rwanda, but rather the budget support that goes to the countries, the government. That if we utilize these punitive measures, that will provide leverage for a solution. And if we're successful, I think, in convincing the administration to move in that direction, which I believe we will work assiduously to do, then we need to have somewhere for Rwanda, Uganda, and other elements in the Congo that don't want a solution. We need to have a place for them to go. And I believe that place is a legitimate, credible, internationally supported peace process that allows the Eastern Congolese people to be part of the solution at the table and the root causes finally to be addressed. And it's not going to happen unless we get U.S. leadership, and that's why we need that presidential envoy. Thank you so much.
Steve.
Just to conclude, there's a great deal of analysis of Rwandan government behavior, which concludes that essentially their sticks don't work, that they're very ambitious, very determined, and that any punitive measures will not necessarily deter their behavior. There's likely a great deal of evidence since our report in June exposed their direct creation of M23. The rebellion has only grown, and their involvement has only become more overt, and I would say many of their commanders have become more emboldened. Obviously, the taking of a very important provincial capital such as Goma was a perfect example of that. However, that doesn't mean, as I said earlier, that we shouldn't continue to frame the problem as a Rwandan determined effort to obtain this objective, which is, as I said, an autonomous Eastern Congo. They believe that any of the short-term consequences of their current project may be outweighed by the gains of that state. Particularly, as I said, given the wealth, the economic interest that Rwanda has in Eastern Congo, the cultural ties and the security interests that they would be able to ensure, including the FDLR and other political dissidents. However, that said, what is needed at this point in order to, faced with that Rwandan determination, a peace process will have to find a way to identify a solution which appears to appeal to their long-term objective in order for them to stop. I'm not convinced that anything less at this stage than something close to that long-term objective would call the Rwandans to stop. However, if that solution is identified, it could be some sort of decentralization process, as already stipulated by the Congolese constitution. However, the implementation of that agreement will require significant accompaniment, tremendous long-term investment, not only from the United States, but other members of the international community, to reinforce the capacities of the Congolese state and precisely insulate it from external control and manipulation. And that will be, as I see, practically and realistically, one of the keys to moving forward from this current crisis. But it requires, as I said, a very long-term commitment to building up an economically and politically independent Congolese state in Eastern Congo, where its neighbors will eventually look at it as an equal and not a a country which it can continue to manipulate, they can continue to manipulate and benefit from. So.
Thank you, all three, for your extraordinary insights again and testimony. And I do want to thank C-SPAN for, in their editorial and independent judgment, seeing their way clear to cover this hearing, because people in America know far too little as to what's going on in DR Congo. And as you pointed out earlier, the enormous loss of life, 6+ million people who have died, and the fact that as we speak, people's lives are being taken from them by this terrible, rebellious M23. So thank you so much, and this hearing is adjourned.
through CSPAN we can get a video.
Yes, on cspan.org.
cspan.org. God bless you. That's good.